Apologies for not being up there. My printer was not working, so I'm going to read from my laptop, and I'm going to do that because if I ad-lib, I'll go hopelessly over time. So I want to talk about the democratic alternatives inside Syria that were so prominent in the early years of the Syrian revolution. Unfortunately, not much attention has been given to them, either in the mainstream media or in much of the alternative media. While many of these inspiring examples have been destroyed, first by sieges, then by Russian and regime bombardment, many people inside and now outside Syria are striving to build alternatives to both the Assad dictatorship and to the counter-revolutionary jihadi groups who have flourished as the conflict's militarised. I also want to look at why these radical grassroots experiments have been written out of history. I'll argue it's partly because of the West's preoccupation with radical Islam and with the geopolitical aspects, and also their preoccupation with the geopolitical aspects of the Syrian conflict that has meant that the internal class dynamics and social forces have been made invisible. But it's also been compounded by the position taken by some of the old left who look at the conflict either through the prism of the Cold War or the Iraq War. I think it's very different to what happened in 2003. There wasn't a mass uprising or revolutionary movement in Iraq at the time that George W. Bush bombed the hell out of Iraq. Essentially, much of this old left echoes Assad's assertion that all opposition to his rule is of an Islamic fundamentalist nature. And this highly misleading perspective is one put by some journalists who once upon a time were heroes, like John Pilger and Robert Fisk. People are aware of the initial peaceful mass protests in 2011, inspired by the events in Tunisia and Egypt and Yemen and Bahrain and elsewhere, even including Saudi Arabia. Whether they were dictatorships that were pro-US or anti-US, it seemed that the Arab Spring was unstoppable. The other thing that sparked the Syrian uprising was the incarceration and torture of those brave Daraa teenagers in the south of the country who had sprayed anti-regime slogans on their high school. People might also be aware that this social movement spread like wildfire across all parts of the country and crossed religious divides. And I can't say that enough, because there is a tendency to see Syria as purely one of a conflict between religions. But one of the most popular slogans in the mass protests were Sunni, Alawi, Christian, the Syrian people are one. People might also note that one response to the state's brutal repression of the movement was to recognise the need for military self-defence. Many ordinary people took up arms for this purpose, and they were joined by Syrian army defectors who together formed Free Syrian Army Brigades, a very decentralised movement, but brigades sprung up across the country. But at the same time, there was a phenomenal response by activists on the ground to ensure that basic services could be delivered to the people in areas where either the regime had retreated and or where they were bombing. Services ranging from education to health to welfare provision to garbage collection. One instigator of this move for bottom-up local councils was Omar Aziz, an intellectual, economist and anarchist who returned to Syria from exile aged 63 in the early days of the Syrian revolution. He worked with younger local activists to collect humanitarian aid and distribute it to suburbs of Damascus that were under attack by the regime. Through his writing and activity, he promoted local self-governance, horizontal organisation, cooperation, solidarity and mutual aid as a means by which people could emancipate themselves from the state. Aziz co-founded the first local committee in Barzeh, Damascus. This example and his article, The Formation of Local Councils, inspired the spread of non-hierarchical self-organisation across Syria. He was incarcerated in Assad's notorious, I'm not sure if I'm going to say it right, Afad prison in late 2012 and only survived in those dungeons for 3 months before dying there in February 2013. But these councils continued to flourish even while the conflict militarised. As recently as March 2016, Layla Al-Shami and Robin Yassin Kassab, in their book Burning Country, I actually dropped by Jura Bookshop this afternoon to pick up their 2 copies, but like a doofus, left them at home because I was madly preparing. I wanted to sell them here. I highly recommend you read Burning Country because it's testament, interviews with people, Alawi, Sunni, Christian, who rose up in 2011, many of whom have been made refugees since. So she points out that as late as March 2016, there were still 395 such local councils operating across the country. Sadly, many of these local councils, for example, the cities of Daraya in the south of Damascus, of Homs, Aleppo, Al-Zabadani and Wadi Barada, have all had a similar destiny, sieged and then bombed out of existence and formally displaced. Rachel's spoken about the Rojava's achievements in relation to local grassroots organisation, and they are both real and significant. But I think it's also important to point out that because the PYD originally declared its neutrality on the question of the Syrian revolution, it meant that despite the historic oppression of the Kurds by the Assadist dynasty, Assad largely left them alone and concentrated his military attacks in opposition-held areas, the non-Kurdish ones. In Rojava, they've largely been able to, until the Turkish incursions, they've largely been able to carry out their experiments in grassroots democracy without the kind of sieges and bombardment that the regime has imposed on the opposition. I guess the question I have for those who see Rojava as the only bright spot in Syria is why not extend the same kind of solidarity to the experiments of bottom-up self-organisation in Syria proper, many of which have now been strangled by the sieges and bombardments that I talk about. I don't really want to go into the conflicts. I mean, I am critical of some of the FSA's elements of the Free Syrian Army that have tied their fortunes to Turkey, most terribly in Afrin. But I think it's also important to point out that while there's been collaboration, for example, in resisting ISIS in Kobane, there were also times where Kurdish forces have taken advantage of Russian and Assad aerial bombardments, like in Aleppo, to take over rebel-held territory. So I certainly don't think it's a one-way blame game. 2 nights ago, I attended a lecture at Sydney University by Zaki Mechi, who's the co-founder and researcher of the Syria Centre for Policy Research, an independent think tank established in Damascus in 2012, but which has since been forced to move to Beirut. The statistics he presented were truly shocking in describing the utter socio-economic and human catastrophe that's taken place. But despite this decimation, which includes, he looked at life expectancy, and as you'd expect, there's been a decline, a small decline in the women population and a decline of about 15 to 20 years in the male population in Syria. So he remains optimistic, however, that the original version of a democratic alternative based on social justice, inclusivity and non-sectarianism can still be achieved. He argued that the vast majority of Syrians are frustrated, and even where people seem to tolerate repressive rule, be that of Assad or of ISIS, for example under Raqqa, they do so only as a matter of survival, but they still yearn for something fundamentally different. I want to look at the example of Eastern Ghouta, which was in the headlines a couple of months ago. Until 2 months ago, it was a vast working class district of around 400,000 people. Like many rebel-controlled areas, it was subjected to an almost complete siege from late 2012 when the Syrian regime lost control of the area. In 2013, the siege was tightened, preventing food and medical supplies. Ghouta became the harshest and longest sustained example of the regime's starve or surrender strategy. It also suffered the worst chemical weapons attack in August 2013, in which 1,500 people were killed. More recently, it bore the brunt of months of Russian and regime bombardment from February to April this year, including another significant chemical attack which sealed the suburb's fate. Assad and his supporters were always keen to characterise the entire population as jihadi fanatics, in Ghouta's case under the sway of the Army of Islam or Jaish al-Islam. This is really far from the truth. Until the mass forced exodus, there were 7.5 years of amazing achievements, and women were central to them. In March, one woman in Ghouta spoke on video as rockets were falling around her. We as women have achieved a lot inside Eastern Ghouta. In the field of education, medicine, relief, the women became head of her household after losing her husband and father. Some men lost their jobs here because of the shelling. There is a lot of pain to talk about and a lot of stories. So some organisations in Ghouta included the Day After organisation, which held forums and lectures on political diversity for women, despite the site of their activities sometimes being subject to attack and the organisers being beaten. Another organisation, Women Now for Development, provides opportunities for women to work on their own projects and conducts workshops on women's rights, which they believe contributed to increased women's participation in elections. Until the exodus, some 70 civil society organisations operated in East Ghouta in sectors including women empowerment, childcare protection, relief, skills training, advocacy, associative action, etc. A dentist from Harasta, one of the cities in Ghouta, said in March, "I do not wish to say that all we have witnessed is horrific. As society, has managed to make great strides in democratic self-governance, the most important being the election of local councils in which all, including women, can participate, something that had not occurred under the 50 years of rule by both Assads. We have also witnessed the development of many civil initiatives to reinforce the idea of human rights and societal development. Yet, as I said, from mid-February to even in the first month of the assault, the Violations Documentation Centre, or VDC for Syria, this itself was set up by a group of social justice activists, including Razan Zaytouneh. They reported 1,678 casualties, of which less than 10% were non-civilians, despite pro-Assad propagandists asserting that everyone within Ghouta was a terrorist jihadi fighter. Over 90% of the casualties were civilians. They were barrel bombed, cluster bombed, attacked by surface-to-surface missiles, napalm, thermobaric bombs, and chlorine. 30 medical facilities were hit. During the bombardment, people were forced to live in basements and then coming up to risk their lives to go to market. Basement schools and medical clinics were popped up, but then the Russian Air Force started using bunker busters, which if happened anywhere else, there would be a mass anti-war movement on the streets, but it did not happen. In comparison, in 2014, when Israel slaughtered 1,462 people in Gaza during a 7-week period, the mainstream anti-war movement mobilised against this, but protests against the bombardment of Ghouta were left to handfuls of Syria Solidarity activists such as myself and increasingly tired and demoralised Syrian refugees. Razan Zaytouneh also founded the Duma Local Coordination Committee, LCC, that I spoke of, one of Syria's first, and was part of resisting and reporting on Assad's abuses as well as the abuses of Jaish al-Islam. Good comment. But in December 2013, Razan was kidnapped with 3 colleagues, her husband and 2 others, by Jaish al-Islam thugs. The Duma 4, as they became known as, have not been seen since. Michael Karajas, who's up the back, who runs a Syrian Revolution blog that I recommend, he says, you know, despite the attempts to say it was all jihadis in Ghouta, he said even the most odious of the Islamist brigades have been unable to dominate over the organs of the revolution, including the democratic local councils. At first, Jaish al-Islam did try and take over the council, but they soon gave up when they, realised it was not going to happen. Also, attempts to label all fighters in Ghouta as Islamic fanatics ignored the substantial presence of Faylaq al-Rahman, the Rahman Brigade, a large Free Syrian Army military coalition, which at times had actually clashed with the Islamic Army. Opponents of Assad have been accused of either calling for US intervention or of being US proxies. Yet with Obama's red line exposed as meaningless and with Trump's one-off theatrics, people on the ground lost their illusions in the West long ago. Likewise, much of the left's preparedness to repeat Assad's assertions about them increases their sense of alienation from the Western left. There is also anger at the United Nations. So while the World Food Programme conducted 257 airdrops of food to Deir ez-Zor, a regime-controlled city in northeast Syria besieged by ISIS from 2015 to 17, the World Food Programme carried out 0 food drops to any areas besieged by the Assad regime, including Ghouta. I think, to quote Michael again, the Assadist justification of the slaughter in Ghouta is identical to the Zionist justification for slaughter in Gaza, the American justification for Fallujah and elsewhere in Iraq, and the Russian justification for Grozny, Chechnya. The Saudi justification for Yemen, the Turkish justification of its decades-long war on the Kurds in the east, and the list goes on. The revolution always had a strong component of intellectuals, students, teachers, artists, and others. It also attracted the rural poor, which Anthony spoke of before, who were driven to the outskirts of the cities. And many of these areas, the shanty towns around Damascus and in East Aleppo, were really the motor of the revolution. Let's not forget also that it wasn't only the Arab Spring's calls for social justice and democracy that fueled the original uprising, but also resistance, as Anthony also said, to Bashar al-Assad's neoliberalism of the economy in the decade leading up. Political demands and economic issues came together. There was also intense anger at the inequality and corruption of the Assad family and its cronies, like Assad's cousin Rami Makhlouf, who controls 60% of the economy through his companies. This is a kind of crony capitalism. It's not a secular socialist state, as some conspiracy theories like the guy over there, who's going to no doubt question me later, is going to say. So now the focus is on Idlib. Again, it's mischaracterized as being dominated by jihadis, this time the HTS, which is the most recent incarnation of Jabhat al-Nusra, formerly linked to al-Qaeda. Yet, as The Guardian reported in May, there is resistance against the reactionary agenda of the Islamists in Idlib, not only by the Free Syrian Army Brigades, but by amazing networks of Syrian women running grassroots civil projects aimed at improving women's social and economic status. Schools, media centres, all the things I listed before for Ghouta. Even amidst the terrible conditions in Idlib, there were local council elections in early 2017, despite the presence of the Islamists. Due to popular pressure from below and demonstrations against the Islamists, they've had to soften some of the rules about social restrictions on women and so on. However, Idlib is now the focus of the military assault. Last Friday, Russian-led airstrikes on the village of Zardana killed 44 people, including 6 children. This attack on a market next to a mosque on a Friday during Ramadan was the deadliest attack this year on Idlib, the province with the largest amount of rebel territory still remaining. Tens of thousands of civilians and some fighters have taken refuge in Idlib after fleeing other parts of the country under evacuation deals with the Assad regime. Idlib is supposedly part of a de-escalation zone agreed last year by Russia, Turkey and Iran. However, now it's described as the killing box with no exit, where all the people have fled to in the past. Where are they going to go now? Especially when Turkey's just built a wall across its border with Syria. Why is this all relatively unknown? Sorry, am I going way over time? Sure. The Assad regime may be brutal, but it's not stupid. It's been adept at presenting itself as a lesser evil, playing on the West's obsession with Islamic terror. To add to the likelihood of this succeeding, while he was imprisoning democratic activists and peaceful protest organisers, he released many of the Islamists who'd been in the prison since the days when he cooperated with George W. Bush in rendition post 9/11. He knew that once they were out, they would distort the dynamics of the revolution. I am going to wind up. Today, the World Cup starts in Russia. And tonight at 1 o'clock, Russia plays Saudi Arabia, which is kind of fitting given the discussion here. Two reactionary imperialist and sub-imperialist powers who've had nothing progressive to contribute to Syria. There has been some media attention on Russia's repression of internal dissent, the rounding up of prostitutes and beggars, the mass euthanasia of dogs, which resulted in 2 million strong petition presented at the Kremlin. University students protesting because their dorms they've been evicted from their dorms to make way for police and soldiers for match security. A Ukrainian film director has been on a hunger strike for a month in a Siberian prison. But there's been very little focus on the fact that Russia's World Cup is filled with Syrian blood. Far from targeting ISIS, whose strongholds were in the east and northeast of the country, Putin's assistance to Assad has been designed to crush the genuine opposition to the regime, including the people who strive for alternatives to both the regime and the jihadi forces. Alternatives based on social justice and democracy in the spirit of the original uprising. But Putin, as Anthony said, has tilted the military balance in Assad's favour. Russia is now escalating in Idlib and also Daraa. Any idea that Assad could be characterised as anti-imperialist should be completely thrown out the window now that we see Russia and Netanyahu doing a deal over the transfer of power in the south of the country near the border of the Golan Heights, which Michael's also written about. Iran, who was used for the first time to bail out Assad in 2013, Iran and Hezbollah, are no longer useful to Assad in this equation. They're an embarrassment to Russia. And basically, because of Putin's friendship with Netanyahu, we can probably see that Iran and Hezbollah, they were used in 2013, but their time is up and likely to be withdrawing from the country after the terrible role that they have played. I've got a lot more to say, however, I am going to wind up. The local coordinating committees were an inspiration, and I think the Arab Spring is far from over. We've just seen a mass wave of protests in Jordan against corruption, against tax increases that forced the resignation of a prime minister. If this original spirit of the Arab Spring can spread, including to Syria, I think this is the source of hope for the future.